Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Vampires in History. Today we're going to be discussing the vampire of Hanover. This will take us to Germany. Sometimes he's also called the Butcher of Hanover, or even the Wolf Man and the Werewolf. His actual name was Friedrich Heinrich Karl Fritz Harmon. He was born October the 25th, 1879 in Hanover, Lower Saxony, which is now Germany. He was the sixth child of a poor couple named Ollie and Joanna, and he was motivated by his sickly mother to play with his sister's dolls instead of doing other kinds of activities. And so he seemed to develop a somewhat feminine personality due to this. He also displayed some somewhat sadistic tendencies in which he liked to scare his sisters in the middle of the night and claim that there were nocturnal supernatural creatures that were, attacking them. He argued often with his father and would regularly threaten to have him placed in jail, apparently because of a rumor that his father, Ollie, might have unalived someone, a train driver. He had a total of around 27 criminal charges that were placed against him for 27 different counts of unalive. After performing terribly in school, he went to military school where he evidently did all right, but then he ended up being discharged for medical reasons. And at that time, he began working at a local cigar factory. Around 1898, he was later arrested for children because he evidently essayed multiple different children. But after undergoing a psychological examination, he was deemed psychologically unfit, and so they sentenced him to stay in a mental institution. After 6 months of staying there, he escaped and he went to Switzerland before he returned to Germany at the age of 20. Then, around 1900, he was able to entice a woman to marry him. Her name was Erna Loert, and he impregnated her with his first child. Then he kind of abandoned her and went to live a life in the military. As a soldier, he was able to do pretty well, and he lived a pretty successful life under this career umbrella. But that came to an abrupt end one October 1901 when he collapsed during an exercise and was diagnosed with a unspecified mental deficiency. They then discharged him and he returned to live with his family. Now, evidently, at some point, his father did try to put him into an asylum, but the local doctors deemed him morally inferior. Then Harmon decided he was going to try to open his own business, but it went bankrupt almost immediately and was closed down. This is when his criminal career began more in depth, if you will, because he began to burglarize homes and, perform different kinds of scams, cons, jobs so that he could gain money, and he was incarcerated off and on for about 2 decades because of various different crimes within that scenario. This made him very well known to Hanover police, and he even became one of their informants in 1918 to help redirect police attention away from himself. World War I then began, and this hit him really hard because of the inflicted national poverty that it placed upon people in his country. And it was at this time that he also started to gain a number of misdemeanor SA offenses. Largely, they went unnoticed, however, because the authorities were never told, and the people that were, the victims were too ashamed to file a report or make any kind of documentation further than that with the authorities. Then something snapped with him, and he unalived a 17-year-old named Friedel Roth on September 25th, 1918. From the eyewitness accounts provided by his friends and family, they were able to raid Harmon's residence, and that was when they found him with a teenage boy in his and evidently it was at that time that he was arrested for SA, but for some unknown reason they never searched his house, and as a result he was cleared of any suspicion of Roth's unaliving. Eventually Harmon was released and later met Hans Granz at the Hanover Central Station. They became friends, and eventually they entered into a romantic relationship. In early 1922 they then moved into an apartment. This was located in a place that is considered to be the haunted area of Hanover, and it was at this time that Harmon began unaliving young men again, this time by luring them in pretending to be a police officer. And his lover became his accomplice after unexpectedly returning home to witness Harmon unaliving a second victim, which was a 17-year-old named Fritz Franke. In the following 9 months, 12 men were unalived this way, with their dismembered remains being dumped on the Lane River and their valuables used to provide the two with money. The unalivings went largely unnoticed until May of 1924, however, when over 500 human bones belonging to Harmon's victims started washing up downstream in the Lane River. Sheer terror then gripped Hanover, and the citizens dubbed the unaliver the Butcher of Hanover. Harmon was quoted, when found, "I never intended to hurt these youngsters, but I knew that if I got going, something would happen, and that made me cry. I would throw myself on top of those boys and bite through the Adam's apple, throttling them at the same time." And this is what made him known as the Vampire of Hanover, because he would do this and bite into their neck, and then he would unalive them and consume their life fluids. His trial began on December the 4th, 1924, and the term serial unaliver had not yet been coined yet, so there were no real other ways to describe him other than butcher, but they also did begin calling him a werewolf or a vampire. He was found guilty of unaliving all of the victims except for 3 that were able to be tied to him, and he was sentenced to execution via guillotine. On April 15th, 1925, he was beheaded, but not before he said his last words, and he said, "I repent, but I do not fear death." The remains of his victims were buried together in a grave at Stalkener Cemetery months before the execution, with a large granite triptych-style memorial inscribed with their names and ages being erected on April 1928. Harmon's head was then preserved in a jar by scientists, who used it in their studies to examine the structure of his brain. It was being kept at the Göttingen Medical School until 2014, when it was finally cremated, which was a long time to keep someone's head after their beheading. Especially, the whole entire story is just macabre, isn't it? As far as Hans Granz, he actually died in 1975 from natural causes. He was arrested July 8, 1924, and found guilty to enticement and unaliving, and then he was cleared after the sentence and had it reduced with a letter written by Harmon that declared he was innocent. So this time he only served 12 years in prison until he was released, and he lived his life out until 1975, when he finally passed. And that is the story of the Vampire of Hanover Germany, Fritz Harmon, on your episode of True Crime Vampires in History. There you go. Hope you guys have a happy Saturday night, and I'll see y'all later.